October 18th, 1957, 10:38 p.m., Lenox Avenue, Harlem. The block outside the lounge didn't look like a boundary line. No barricades, no uniforms, no warning signs. Just men posted in doorways like they were waiting for a friend. Albert Anastasia stepped out of a sedan that didn't belong in that light. He didn't pause to take in the street. He didn't ask if the room was ready for him. He moved the way men move when they've spent a lifetime teaching the city to make space. Two of his guys stayed close, not crowding him, not talking. They weren't there to start something. They were there to make sure nothing started without permission. Inside, Harlem was doing what it always did on a Friday night. Jazz in the front, quiet business in the back, and behind the door that led away from the music, a private room waited with the kind of stillness that meant someone had already decided how the night would end. Bumpy Johnson didn't come out to greet him. That was the first message. In Harlem, introductions were a form of control. If you walked into a man's territory and he didn't stand up, it meant he wasn't impressed by your name, or he didn't believe you were the one who mattered. Anastasia understood territory. He'd helped draw lines in New York with bodies. He'd enforced decisions nobody ever signed. He'd sat at tables where men talked softly and cities changed hands. But Harlem didn't operate like the rest of the city. Harlem had its own economy, its own politics, its own rules for respect. And Bumpy Johnson was one of the few men in New York who could call a place his, not because he owned buildings, but because he owned obedience. The reason Anastasia came wasn't a social call. It wasn't charity. It wasn't curiosity. It was pressure from money that wasn't coming in on time. Pressure from men who wanted a neighborhood that refused to be purchased. Pressure from a system that had started to believe Harlem could be treated like any other piece of real estate. That night a line was tested. And when a line like that gets tested, someone always pays. The story that followed became one of those underworld accounts told in careful voices, part police intelligence, part street memory, part warning. Because whether every detail survives clean or not, the turning point does. A powerful man walked into Bumpy Johnson's territory expecting the usual outcome. What happened instead rewrote what untouchable meant in Harlem. The invitation that didn't sound like one. The message didn't come directly from Bumpy Johnson. It rarely did when the stakes were real. Harlem didn't hand out invitations like favors. It handed them out like traps with clean edges, delivered through a man who could later swear he only repeated what he heard, who could shrug and say it wasn't official. That was the point. If the meeting went wrong, the messenger could disappear back into the street without leaving fingerprints on either side. Anastasia understood that language. In his world, the most dangerous decisions were never spoken by the men who wanted them done. Orders traveled through intermediaries, through dinners that weren't dinners, through casual remarks that carried consequences. But Harlem had its own version of the same system, built around pride instead of paperwork. Here, even the act of being summoned was a test of rank. The word was simple. There was a room. There was a door. And the door would open if Anastasia chose to walk through it. That condition mattered. It meant nobody was begging him to come. It meant the meeting wasn't being offered as a compromise. It was being offered as a measurement. If he didn't show, Harlem would say he was afraid to cross Lenox, afraid to sit under Bumpy's ceiling, afraid to look a man in the eye where the street could see the outcome. And if he did show, Harlem would still have its story. They would say Bumpy Johnson called and Albert Anastasia answered. They would say the Italians could reach into Harlem, but they still had to knock first. Reputation didn't cancel protocol. It only raised the price of ignoring it. Anastasia didn't need advice to understand the risk. Walking into Harlem meant stepping into a place where his protection was thinner than usual. He could bring men, but too many men would look like an invasion. Too few would look like weakness. And any show of force that played well downtown could backfire here, because Harlem's pride didn't bend the same way. Harlem didn't respond to threat by yielding. It responded by making the threat expensive. So the invitation was never really a choice between coming and not coming. It was a choice between losing control in public or taking the risk of being tested in private. And Anastasia chose the room, because men like him didn't survive by refusing tests. They survived by walking into them as if they'd already passed. Anastasia crosses the line like it's already his. Anastasia didn't announce himself to Harlem. He didn't ask permission. He arrived as if the city belonged to him by default, because for most of his adult life that had been true. In the downtown clubs and Brooklyn social rooms, men adjusted their posture when he entered. But Harlem wasn't downtown. Harlem was a place where power had to be translated, where names didn't carry the same weight unless they were backed by something the neighborhood could feel. Anastasia came with reputation. Harlem waited to see if he came with leverage. He crossed north without entourage, without a motorcade, without the theater most men used to signal importance. Just a car, one driver, and timing that suggested he wasn't worried about being followed. That choice was deliberate. Too much protection would have looked like fear. Too little would have looked careless. Anastasia understood balance. He had survived too long not to. The streets noticed him anyway. They always did. A white man like that, dressed the way he dressed, moving the way he moved, didn't blend. He cut through the block like a foreign object. Conversations thinned, faces turned. The message moved faster than he did. Anastasia's here. The name passed from stoop to storefront without needing explanation. This was Bumpy Johnson's territory. Everyone knew that. And everyone knew that territory wasn't just about money. It was about permission, about who decided which rules applied and which ones bent. Anastasia walking those streets without being challenged wasn't a sign of acceptance. It was a pause. Harlem taking a breath before deciding how to respond. Anastasia understood that pause. He didn't rush it. He didn't slow down either. He walked like a man who assumed the road would stay clear, because stopping to check would have broken the spell. Power only works when it behaves like it's inevitable. He passed bars where the music kept playing, but the laughter didn't. Past men who could have made a call, could have started something, but didn't. Not yet. Harlem was measuring him the same way he measured rooms. Who noticed? Who looked away? Who made eye contact and held it just long enough to show they weren't impressed? By the time he reached the place he'd been directed to, the point had already been made. Anastasia could enter Harlem without blood being spilled. That alone meant something, but it wasn't enough. Entry wasn't victory. It was admission to an exam. Inside, men would decide whether his reputation could survive translation, whether downtown rules could stand under Harlem ceilings, and whether Albert Anastasia was walking into a conversation or into a correction. He didn't know which yet. He only knew that turning back now would answer the question for him. The numbers money, the one stream everyone wanted to drink from. In 1957, Harlem's numbers racket wasn't just gambling. It was cash flow, employment, and survival stitched together into an informal economy that fed people the city didn't plan to feed. Every outside crew that tried to muscle in made the same mistake. They saw poor bettors and thought easy money. They didn't see the infrastructure behind it: runners, bankers, collectors, protectors, and the quiet agreements that kept the whole thing stable. Bumpy Johnson didn't just run numbers. He managed order, and when order is profitable, outsiders come looking to tax it. The numbers moved every morning before the city woke up. Pennies and dollars collected from barber shops, groceries, back rooms, and kitchens where the radio stayed on low. Runners knew their routes. Bankers knew their limits. Collectors knew who needed time and who didn't. The system worked because it was local, because the people taking the bets lived next door to the people placing them. When disputes happened, they were settled quietly, without police, without spectacle. That stability made the money predictable. Predictable money attracts attention. Downtown families saw Harlem's numbers as a river flowing north, untouched by their hands. They didn't respect it, but they wanted it. And they believed reputation alone could collect what leverage hadn't earned. Albert Anastasia understood numbers differently than most. He didn't confuse gambling with chaos. He knew the value of steady streams. He also knew that taking a percentage without breaking the machine required permission, not force. Force shut businesses down. Permission kept them running. Bumpy Johnson understood this too. That was why Harlem hadn't burned, despite decades of pressure. Every outside attempt to skim without consent had been answered, not always with violence, but with disruption. Routes changed. Runners disappeared. Bets dried up. The machine protected itself. When Anastasia's name started circling Harlem, it wasn't because he'd sent collectors. He hadn't. That would have been a declaration of war. The rumor was quieter. He wanted to talk. He wanted to understand how much the river carried and who decided where it flowed. To Harlem, that mattered. Talking meant acknowledgement. It meant he saw the structure, not just the cash. But it also raised a question. Was Anastasia there to respect the order or replace it? Numbers money doesn't forgive mistakes. If runners feel threatened, they stop running. If bankers feel exposed, they shut doors. If bettors feel disrespected, they play elsewhere. Bumpy had built something that could survive pressure because it was woven into daily life. Anyone who wanted a share had to prove they wouldn't tear it apart reaching for it. And in Harlem, proof wasn't promised. It was demonstrated. The $50,000 problem. Buying a door that doesn't sell the offer didn't come wrapped like a threat. It came like a solution. A neat number spoken in a calm voice, as if it could clean up every complication. $50,000 enough to turn a desperate man's stomach into an obedient instrument. Not paid through a bank, not written down, handed off through an intermediary who smiled too easily and never said the word contract. That's how assassination money moved in New York when it was sanctioned, quietly, with plausible deniability, and with the assumption that every man had a price. The problem wasn't the amount. The problem was the assumption behind it. $50,000 was meant to buy access, not violence. It was meant to open a door inside Harlem without forcing it. Someone close enough to Bumpy Johnson to arrange a meeting that ended badly. Someone who could make a mistake at the right moment. Someone who would later say it was an accident. Big Sam fit the profile. He wasn't a boss. He wasn't a street legend. He was reliable, known, and carrying weight he couldn't afford. Sick family, late rent, a daughter whose future was already being negotiated by people she'd never meet. Men like Sam didn't dream about betrayal. They calculated survival. The intermediary didn't rush him. That was part of the method. No pressure. No threats. Just certainty. The money would be there when Sam decided, and if he didn't decide, someone else would. The city always found another pair of hands. What the offer failed to account for was Harlem's economy of loyalty. It wasn't sentimental. It was practical. Betrayal didn't just cost lives. It collapsed trust networks that kept money moving. A single bad actor could freeze routes, spook runners, and turn steady income into chaos. $50,000 looked large until weighed against what stopped working when order broke. Sam understood that too late. The money promised relief, not safety. It promised silence, not protection. And once it changed hands, it wouldn't belong to him anymore. It would belong to the men who paid it. And they would collect interest in ways that didn't show on paper. Anastasia's people believed the math was simple. Identify pressure. Apply cash. Wait. That formula had worked across boroughs where reputation did the rest of the enforcing. Harlem complicated the equation. Here, money that arrived without permission didn't buy cooperation. It bought attention, and attention in Harlem moved faster than money. By the time the offer settled into Sam's thoughts, it was already being measured by people who didn't need to be told what $50,000 meant. Not as a gift, as a problem. Because buying a door that doesn't sell doesn't open it. It tells the house someone thinks it should. The man who breaks, loyalty as a job, survival as a debt. Harlem didn't fall apart because outsiders were strong. It fell apart when insiders got squeezed. That was always the real entry point. The underworld didn't need you to hate the man you betrayed. It only needed you to feel trapped. A bodyguard with medical bills. A collector behind on rent. A lieutenant whose family could be threatened more easily than his conscience could be persuaded. The Italians understood that better than anyone. They didn't recruit traitors by ideology. They recruited them by pressure, then called it business. Big Sam had worked Harlem long enough to know how loyalty functioned there. It wasn't romantic. It was transactional, reinforced by memory and proximity. Bumpy Johnson paid on time. He protected families. He remembered names. Men stayed loyal because loyalty worked. Until it didn't, Sam's breaking point wasn't sudden. It was cumulative. Bills stacked. Promises from the street stopped covering hospital visits. Every delay felt like a personal failure. Harlem respected endurance, but endurance didn't stop eviction notices, and pride didn't negotiate with doctors. When Anastasia's people reached him, they didn't insult his loyalty. They didn't ask him to choose sides. They framed it as inevitability. Harlem was going to change. Pressure was coming. Sam could either get ahead of it or get crushed under it. $50,000 wasn't pitched as blood money. It was pitched as insulation, a way to survive what was already happening. That framing mattered. Sam didn't see himself as betraying Harlem. He saw himself as adapting, adjusting to a shift he couldn't stop. He told himself he wasn't pulling a trigger. He was just opening a door. What happened after wouldn't be his responsibility. That was the lie pressure always sold. That distance existed between action and consequence. But in Harlem, distance collapsed fast. Information moved through looks, pauses, silences that lasted half a second too long. A missed meeting. A man asking the wrong question. Loyalty wasn't measured by speeches. It was measured by instinct. And Sam's instincts had started hesitating. Bumpy Johnson didn't need proof at first. He needed patterns. He noticed when Sam stopped speaking freely, when he lingered near exits, when his eyes tracked hands instead of faces. Fear left fingerprints no money could hide. The tragedy wasn't that Sam broke. Men broke every day. The tragedy was that he believed survival could be purchased without cost. In Harlem, survival was communal. If you survived alone, it meant someone else paid. And once a man accepted that kind of debt, it didn't belong to him anymore. It belonged to the city. And the city always collected. The wall table. Where humiliation does more work than violence, Bumpy Johnson's real strength wasn't that he could order a man killed. Plenty of men could do that. His strength was that he understood which punishments lasted. Sometimes the cleanest victory wasn't blood. It was public exposure. A betrayal revealed in front of the exact people whose respect the traitor needed to survive. Bumpy didn't have to hunt a disloyal man through the city if he could make that man destroy himself in a room full of witnesses. Harlem didn't just punish disloyalty, it recorded it. The wall table sat against brick, stained by years of smoke and listening. It wasn't special furniture. That was the point. Men sat there when the room needed to see them clearly. No shadows, no corners, just faces and posture and the weight of attention. Conversations held there were short. They didn't wander. They ended things. Bumpy used the table when he wanted a lesson to travel without needing explanation. Violence required cleanup. It invited retaliation. Humiliation traveled on its own. It followed a man into every room after he left. Once the neighborhood saw you exposed, every future interaction carried that stain. When Big Sam was called in, there was no accusation waiting for him. No raised voice, no speech. That silence was deliberate. It forced him to fill the space himself. Men who hadn't done anything wrong usually did. They asked why they were there. They joked. They relaxed. Sam didn't. He stood too straight. He spoke too carefully. His eyes kept checking the door, then returning to the table as if it might move. That was enough. Bumpy didn't name Anastasia. He didn't mention money. He didn't have to. He asked Sam a single question about a route that no longer existed. A collection schedule that had already changed. The wrong answer would have meant ignorance. The right answer meant access Sam shouldn't have had. Sam answered correctly. Then he realized what he'd done. The room didn't react. No gasps, no movement. Men looked down, not out of sympathy, but calculation. They were learning where the line was, and who had crossed it. Bumpy nodded once. That was the sentence. Sam wasn't dragged out. He wasn't touched. He was allowed to leave the room alive, which was the cruelest part, because now everyone knew. And knowing was enough to end him. In Harlem, a man without trust couldn't collect, couldn't hire, couldn't hide. The street would do the rest without being told. That was the work the wall table did. It turned betrayal into isolation, and isolation in a place built on networks was a slower death than violence ever was. The click, the gun that doesn't fire, and the moment the room becomes a court. When the weapon failed, it didn't feel like luck. It felt like design, a hard, small sound that froze a room and forced everyone inside it to choose a posture. The ones who moved too fast looked guilty. The ones who looked away looked complicit. The ones who stayed still understood the rules. In a room like that, motion could be confession. If this was a setup, it wasn't built to save a life by accident. It was built to turn an assassination attempt into evidence, and to make the act of betrayal impossible to deny. The gun was never meant to work. That was the part most men missed when they replayed the moment later. A working gun would have ended the problem quickly. A failed one turned the room into a record. Everyone present became a witness, whether they wanted to be or not. The click carried farther than a shot would have. A shot echoed and vanished. The click stayed. It lived in the silence that followed, in the way men inhaled and forgot to exhale, in the way chairs didn't scrape and hands didn't rise. No one reached for a weapon because reaching would have meant choosing a side too early. Bumpy Johnson didn't move. That was the signal. A man who panics gives the room permission to panic. A man who stays still forces everyone else to measure themselves against him. Bumpy's stillness wasn't bravery. It was control. He knew exactly what had just happened, and exactly who had failed. Across the room, Big Sam understood it at the same time everyone else did. The gun in his hand wasn't just useless. It was loud. It said he had agreed to something he couldn't undo. It said money had touched him. It said someone thought he could be bought and that they were almost right. Bumpy didn't shout. He didn't accuse. He didn't need to. The room was already doing the work. Men stared at the floor, not because they were afraid of violence, but because they were afraid of association. Guilt was contagious. Distance was survival. That was the moment the room became a court. No judge, no jury selection, just a shared understanding of what had crossed the line and who had crossed it. Evidence didn't need to be explained. It had announced itself. When Bumpy finally spoke, it was only to say the meeting was over. That was the verdict. Sam was still breathing, still standing, but his life had already narrowed. Every exit he would take from that point forward led away from protection. The click didn't end the night. It began the consequences. And everyone who heard it knew the same thing. Harlem had just watched a betrayal fail in public. And public failure was something no one ever fully survived. What Harlem learned: untouchable doesn't always mean protected. After the night ended, the real impact wasn't measured by gunfire or bodies. It was measured by behavior, by which envelopes started arriving on time, by which intermediaries stopped smiling, by which outside names stopped getting spoken too loudly in Harlem rooms. Stories like this survive because they explain a shift in gravity. They show how power can be enforced without a public war, how a neighborhood can keep its dignity without pretending it's innocent, how a man becomes untouchable, not because nobody can reach him, but because reaching him costs more than anyone is willing to pay. The days that followed were quieter than expected. That was the point. No retaliations announced. No crews rolling in to make a show of strength. Downtown, men who had once spoken about Harlem like it was a resource adjusted their language. They didn't renounce interest. They recalculated risk. Interest without leverage was just curiosity, and curiosity didn't pay bills. In Harlem, the lesson spread without being taught. Runners moved with more confidence. Bankers closed earlier. Meetings shortened. There was a sense that something had been settled without being explained. That kind of settlement held better than any truce signed in ink. It didn't rely on memory. It relied on consequence. Albert Anastasia learned something too. Not about fear. He already understood fear. He learned about translation. Reputation traveled well in his neighborhoods because it arrived with enforcement that matched it. In Harlem, reputation needed context. It needed permission to mean something. Power that didn't adapt became expensive to use. Bumpy Johnson didn't declare victory. He didn't have to. He let the city do what cities do best when the rules are clear. He allowed rumors to carry the shape of the truth. He allowed silence to harden into policy. Men who understood the moment adjusted their behavior. Men who didn't found themselves alone. Big Sam disappeared from conversations without needing to disappear from the street. That was the final proof. Harlem didn't need to erase him physically. It erased him functionally. He became a man people didn't need anymore. And in an economy built on need, that was terminal. Untouchable, Harlem learned, wasn't immunity. It was deterrence. It meant you could be reached, but the act of reaching you would trigger costs that outweighed the reward. Violence was optional. Exposure was permanent. That night didn't end conflict. It refined it. It reminded everyone watching that dominance didn't always announce itself with blood. Sometimes it arrived as a lesson delivered once, remembered forever.